This is Michael Parenti. Welcome to Real History, a series of talks by me on different subjects of historical importance that are relevant for understanding today's realities. Most people, I discovered, are never exposed to real history. In school, we usually don't read history. We read history textbooks, and mainstream ones at that, which avoid the underlying realities and propagate myths that serve the powers that be. Well, for those of us who might have a stronger dedication to truth and democracy, let's look at some real history. What I'm really going to talk about today is the distortion of history, the way history has been distorted by a particular mode of investigation, what might be called, and what has been called, psychohistory. This is a development both in history and political science to reduce historical phenomena to psychological motivations that have to do with early life. Harold Lasswell, a political scientist, is a pioneer in this unfortunate field. Lasswell argued that much political phenomena, many political attitudes, are principally a displacement of feelings from earlier family and childhood experiences. In other words, Lasswell argues, the prominence of hate in politics suggests that we may find that the most important private motive is a repressed and powerful hatred of authority, a hatred which has come to partial expression and repression in relation to the father. The repressed father hatred may be turned against kings or capitalists. This is Lasswell speaking. Individuals who condemn the merciless exploitation of the toolless proletariat by the capitalists may just be voicing, quote, the rational justification of earlier unresolved family animosities. In other words, if you protest what the U.S. is doing in the name of big corporations in Central America, or what capitalist corporations are doing to our environment and our food and our water, you may very well just have a thing about authority, and this relates to something that happened to you in your childhood. Lasswell does not deal with the perhaps the more evident possibility that people hate kings or capitalists because they find the social conditions imposed by autocracy and plutocracy to be hurtful to themselves. Let me give you another example. In 1969, the noted psychologist Bruno Bettelheim ascribed the student anti-war protest that was sweeping the nation's campuses to the influence of a permissive society and to the guilt the students suffered because they had avoided military service. In other words, the students were not really bothered by the murder and the carnage of the Vietnam War, but they were bothered by the fact that they'd been able to evade their moral obligation to participate in the war by evading the draft. They were guilt-ridden from that. By the way, the anti-war movement, of course, involved not only students, but hundreds of thousands of people beyond draft age who presumably wouldn't have been suffering this guilt. As Bettelheim explained it, Bruno Bettelheim, the great psychologist, explained this to a special House Education Subcommittee. The guilt-ridden students, having evaded military service, quote, feel like parasites of society, and hence come to hate a society which they think makes them feel this way. Let's take another psychological genius, Louis Foyer, a political scientist. He diagnoses just about every student rebellion in the 20th century as suffering from irrational hostility toward parental figures. Foyer says that the reason Fidel Castro became such a revolutionary was because his father forced him to go to law school. He hated this, and he was in a father rebellion, and this repetitive theme of resentment about being in law school, Foyer concludes, suggests, I'm quoting Foyer, suggests some of the roots of Castro's own generational conflict and indirectly his anti-Americanism. In his blaming of others for having misled him, the United States became a surrogate father to be blamed. I'm not writing this, Foyer is. Now, not all student rebellions, by the way, pursue pseudo-goals and have this irrational rebellion against authority. Foyer finds some student rebellions as being very good. And those are the ones that took place in communist countries, because they represented, quote, a quest for real freedom. But one could raise the question, in a Cuba that was ruled by a much-hated American-backed tyrant like General Batista, a Cuba in which the land and the major industries and the finances and the capital and the markets were dominated totally by U.S. companies for the purpose of their own profits, in a Cuba where children went hungry while wealth was taken out of the country by the Americans, are we really to believe, regardless of what we may think of Cuba today, are we really to believe that a Cuban's grievances toward the detested Yankees were primarily a displacement of filial hostility? And what about the many thousands of others who joined Castro's revolutionary ranks? They weren't even in, many of them weren't even in law school. Many of them didn't have fathers who pushed them into school. Were they really father resented? Was that what their father resentment was, what they were displacing onto the United States? Well, this kind of thinking is what we might call a self-determining psychologism. That is, it reduces the motivating forces of human behavior to psychology. It says all things can reduce back to a personal interior psychology, and it expands psychology into something of an all-permeating social force. What is missing is observable evidence. I mean, the thing you can say about Bettelheim and Louis Foya is neither of them come up with any evidence to support their analysis. I mean, how do they know that? All we have are imputations that deny the manifest content of political struggle. I mean, to deny the issues that seem to be right before our eyes, and they ascribe some mysterious psychic motive that's best known to the investigator through a process of discovery which the investigator does not reveal. What these psychological explanations do is they tend to depoliticize political reality. But by the way, they do it in a politically selective way. I gave you the example of Foya, who depoliticizes the student rebellions he doesn't like, but accepts the politics of the student rebellions whose politics he does like. For instance, Bettelheim never thought it necessary to search for pathology in those who ordered the B-52 carpet bombing of Indochina. You know, he never thought it necessary to look at the people who perpetrated that murderous war as suffering from some kinds of psychological displacements and psychological problems. What is then, or what is or is not a psychological displacement is often determined by political expectations, the political expectations of the psychologist. So rebellion against authority then becomes prima facie evidence of rebellion against parental authority once removed. There's no real need to demonstrate the linkage. It's been established by a reference to, quote, clinical evidence. Clinical evidence which has no command over political data unless one assumes it does. The psychological explanation, then, harbors a post hoc fallacy. Let me give it to you this way. It goes as follows. The political rebel is really rebelling against parental authority. Proof? The rebel is rebelling. And by the way, this problem exists in all innate drive theories that claim to explain observable behavior. You know, we're told that people are impelled by a drive for power, or a drive for love, or a drive to accumulate wealth, that this is a drive in them, something in their psychological makeup. And evidence for such claims are then found in instances of people pursuing power, pursuing love, and pursuing wealth. In other words, the theory uses the very phenomenon it is trying to explain as evidence of its explanation. Let me give an illustration of how this works. Let me give an illustration of the abuses of psychohistory and the uses of it. Let's consider Victor Wolfenstein's psychological study of Lenin. It's a book he wrote on Lenin, Trotsky, and Gandhi, three leaders whom he said, quote, came to have revolutionary identities as a result of essentially interminable conflicts with parental authority. Lenin was raised in a family, Wolfenstein says, quote, not bothered by unusual stress or disruption. All the children got along well together. There all seemed to be a warm, loving atmosphere. Lenin's father is described by Wolfenstein as a warm, patient, loving father who devoted lots of time to his children. So did Lenin's mother. They played games together. The parents taught them to read, to play chess, to play the piano. They led them in family singing. They all helped together composing a weekly handwritten little family magazine. It sounds really like a pretty good family, a really good kind of family, the kind we used to have before the automobile and television came in and made all that obsolete. The picture Wolfenstein draws of Lenin himself is also generally positive. As a child, Lenin appears to have been jovial, humorous, loud, a practical joker, given somewhat to boasting and bullying, but on the whole well-liked and likable, Wolfenstein says. Young Lenin enjoyed easy success in schoolwork and was held in esteem by teachers. In all, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was, quote, a bright, assertive, but not unusual lad, unquote. Well, then you ask, where did the pathological revolutionary come from? Well, it turns out that Lenin's father was occasionally kept away from his family by long periods of time by his official duties. He had to travel, and Wolfenstein makes much of this. I quote him. It must have had a strange effect on young Lenin's mind when a loving and attentive person was there one day and gone the next, and often gone for weeks running. The pattern of alternating great attention and prolonged absence, and hence inattention, which characterized Lenin's relationship with his father, probably produced strongly ambivalent feelings, unquote. Wolfenstein does not consider the likelihood that while Lenin and the other children may certainly have missed their father during his job-related travels, they seemed securely enough placed in his affections not to have reacted with feelings of abandonment and betrayal, or that other sinister word that the psychohistorians use, ambivalence. Wolfenstein also said that a lot of Lenin's adult behavior was shaped by a sibling rivalry which he had with a younger sister, and this gave him a certain mistrustfulness. There's no evidence for the rivalry except that Lenin was a slow learner in learning how to walk, and they say that he was a slow learner because the younger sister came along and he was in competition with her. That's Wolfenstein's conjecture. Well, in any case, that rivalry led to Lenin's mistrustfulness and the aggressiveness, I'm quoting Wolfenstein, and the aggressiveness which grows out of mistrust. This has deep roots indeed in Lenin's life experiences. A predisposition would exist towards viewing the world in kill or be killed terms. All this from a little younger sister in a warm, loving family atmosphere. Lenin, by the way, had a very admiring and loving identification with his older brother and with his father, which was frequently expressed by him both verbally and in the way he emulated each. So, there is evidence to support that. But this, too, becomes another source of pathology in the psychologist's hands. The death of both father and brother, it seemed, evoked intense guilt feelings in Lenin, who, according to Wolfenstein, again offering no evidence of that, but just claiming and asserting it, harbored a love-hate ambivalence for both older men, which was, quote, the central problem of his life. Wolfenstein eventually settles the whole thing by lowering the Freudian boom. Quote, Lenin, it must be remembered, felt he bore the double responsibility for the deaths of his father and brother, whom he had wished dead in order that he might possess his mother. You got it. What is missing is any evidence, unquote, after mother, I'm talking now. What's missing is any evidence that Lenin nursed such compelling feelings of guilt, aggression, ambivalence, hate, and Oedipal murder toward his brother and father. If Lenin felt bad about anybody, it was the Tsar who executed his brother for being a revolutionary. But that's the wonderful thing about psychohistory. You can just announce these vast causalities from mysterious, unseen regions. And by the way, no evidence is really needed for that last interpretation, since the Oedipus complex has been declared a universal one, part of every son's psychic heritage. Thus, it's a common affliction, and it can be used to explain a most uncommon man. By the way, this Oedipus conflict also led Lenin to Marxism, if we let Wolfenstein tell it. Quote, in Marx, Lenin found a benevolent, omniscient father, a wise and methodical teacher, a fit repository for his feelings of love and respect for his real father, and in the Tsar, the perfect embodiment of the vengeful Oedipal father. He found his dangerous opponent, over whom, however, Marx promised victory. Unquote. Well, this treatment of Lenin invites the criticisms I made earlier, that almost anything about a person can be endowed with psychopathological significance and then weaved into his or her political life. Both A and the opposite of A can be treated as evidence of pathology, both a loving, gentle father and a harsh, unloving one, both a positive identification with familial figures and a negative one. And at times, no data will do quite well as when we invoke the universal Oedipal curse. Let me give you one more example, the case of Herbert Hoover. This is to show that it's not just a matter of psychohistory being used against radicals and rebels. It could also be used against conservatives. Herbert Hoover, a case study of Herbert Hoover, appears in James David Barber's book on the presidential character. Barber's treatment of Hoover, a man whom he categorizes as an active negative president. The active negative president, by the way, is one who experiences severe deprivation in childhood and who subsequently tries to wring from his environment a sense of self-worth through achievement and a search for power over others. Well, according to Barber, Hoover suffered from a fatal flaw of character that caused him to discard an earlier flexibility for a latter-day self-defeating rigidity. The early Hoover was a pragmatic miracle worker, a humanitarian, a man who brought aid and food to the starving people of Europe in the midst of World War I and right afterwards. But Barber has this problem. How could this Herbert Hoover, the pragmatic miracle worker who did all these good things, why would he freeze in opposition to relief for jobless Americans? That is, the same Herbert Hoover, when he became President of the United States, refused to give aid to workers in the midst of the Depression. Dave Barber tells us that Hoover was an emotionally blocked man with an unhappy childhood that left him very emotionally blocked, taciturn, humorless, reserved, and seldom capable of crying. In fact, Hoover had a marriage in which he was very emotionally attached to his wife. The little evidence that Barber offers seems to contradict this picture of this taciturn, humorless fellow. Hoover could express anger. On one occasion, when he threatened to fight a heckler in the 1932 campaign, Barber notes it. That doesn't seem like an emotionally blocked fellow. Hoover could cry. Dave Barber cites 2 instances when he was moved to tears in public. I don't know how many times a less emotively blocked president is expected to cry in public. In fact, if you cry in public, it can cost you politically, as Musty found out years ago. Hoover was profoundly moved both emotionally and to action when visited in the White House by 3 children who were pleading to have their unemployed father released from jail. And by the way, the only contemporary testimony Barber offers of one of Hoover's contemporaries, Eugene Lyons, and he said, and this is what Lyons says about Hoover. Hoover was not cold, but, quote, a sensitive, soft-hearted person who craves affection, enjoys congenial company, and suffers under the slings of malice, unquote. Well, what I'm saying, in sum, is that the data that Barber offers on Hoover's life are not only selective and sketchy, but they lend themselves to a contrary interpretation. Barber fails to make a convincing case that the traits he ascribes to Hoover are the dominant components of his character or are endowed with the significance that Barber attributes to them. The consequence is that one comes away with the feeling that the author is telling us rather than showing us, and we are left asking, how does he know that about Hoover? Finally, and most important, even if the things said about Hoover's personality are true, they do not seem to have much explanatory power when applied to his public behavior. They don't explain why Hoover acted with such self-rigidity. And in fact, I'm going to give you an alternative interpretation. That is, in place of the psychological Hoover, I will give you the political Hoover. How could Hoover, the man who administered relief to the children of war-torn Europe, refuse to sign a relief bill for American children, hungry, millions of American children who were hungry and other American adults during the Depression when he was a president? The very kind of bill that brought down his own presidency. The very kind of rigidity that brought down his own presidency. Well, before proposing some psychological compulsion, let's investigate the political Hoover. because therein may rest the cues to his political actions. I mean, I believe, I'm kind of old-fashioned, I believe that if you want to understand political actions, you ought to look at political things, at least as the first step. Dave Barber quotes in his book, The Presidential Character, he quotes President Hoover as saying, quote, "The sole function of government is to bring about a condition of affairs favorable to the beneficial development of private enterprise." Did you get that? Dave Barber didn't say it. I didn't say that. President Herbert Hoover said that. And I would say that indeed, if you look at Hoover's career, it reveals a rather consistent, lifelong dedication to the private enterprise system at both at home and abroad. As head of the private organization, the Belgian Relief Commission, and later as director of the American Relief Administration, Hoover administrated aid in a highly political way. Contrary to the view that he was a great humanitarian, the Belgian distribution program had the aura of a business enterprise. The population of Belgium paid for most of its food when they could, and they were classed as charity cases when they couldn't. The donations of food made in this country and elsewhere were sold to the Belgians at wartime prices for cash, just as though they had been bought in the open market. So people who were contributing, making donations to Hoover's Belgian Relief Commission, thinking that this charitable food was going to the Belgians, found out that Hoover was selling it to the Belgians. The system was so organized that Belgium was drained of money in exchange for food. And the Belgians protested, by the way. In fact, there remained drastic shortages arose in 1916. There were hunger riots among the poor classes, that is, among those who couldn't pay Herbert Hoover's prices. So much for Herbert Hoover, the flexible humanitarian. By the war's end, Hoover was concerned with more important things than feeding Belgians. As early as November 1918, he made it clear that food was to be used as a political weapon, just as it's used today in U.S. foreign aid. It was to be used to stem the tide of Bolshevism. That's a quote of Herbert Hoover's. When Hoover's American Relief Administration sent aid to Russia, it was for a purpose never intended by Congress. Congress voted aid to Soviet Russia because people were starving in Soviet Russia, but Hoover sent the aid to the areas occupied by the reactionary White Guard armies. And in the Baltics, in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, to areas that were occupied by General von der Goltz, the German Expeditionary Force general, the murderer and killer, who could round up and exterminate whole villages and shoot Jews for the fun of it. Both these armies were dedicated to overthrowing the Soviet government, and both of them engaged in widespread pillaging and executing of civilians. One White Guard army, Udenich's army, subsisted, by the way, totally on Hoover's aid and was able to go on with its murder and its terror thanks to Herbert Hoover. In a report to Congress in January 1921, Herbert Hoover admitted that he had used U.S. relief funds to supply the white armies. Hoover did it again in Hungary. He withheld food shipments to Hungary because he didn't like the politics of the revolutionary Bela Kun government, which was overthrown. By the way, the supplies were purchased with funds advanced by the Bela Kun government. They paid for the funds, but Hoover wouldn't send the aid. Aid only came after the reactionary Admiral Horthy was installed, a right-wing fascist, who was backed by the bayonets of the Romanian army, which instituted a white terror, executing hundreds of revolutionaries and Jews. He used food also as a political weapon in Austria, and said that this was a race against both starvation and communism, and you could take your choice. If you choose communism, you're going to get starvation. That same year, by the way, Senator James Reed of Missouri charged on the Senate floor that $40 million of relief funds voted by Congress to feed the hungry, quote, was spent to keep the Polish army in the field. I should point out that Poland was given aid also. Hoover placed large sums of money at the disposal of the right-wing Polish militarists during their invasion of Soviet Russia in April 1920. By the way, that's another one of those historical facts that are kept as a great secret, that Poland invaded Soviet Russia in 1920. Well, was Hoover motivated by concern for his personal investments, by the way? Well, that might be part of it. While he was described as an engineer, and a great engineer by some of his admirers, Herbert Hoover, in fact, was a multi-millionaire with business ventures in, you ready, in Burma, Nigeria, Australia, South Africa, Nicaragua, the United States, and he had huge investments in Tsarist Russia. He joined up with Leslie Urquhart, a British capitalist, and he floated the Russo-Asiatic Corporation, which would have had holdings, concessions in timberland, mines, railroads, factories, refineries, totaling billions of dollars. Had the Soviet government not canceled these vast concessions, had the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, not taken place, Herbert Hoover would have not just been a multimillionaire, he would have been maybe one of the top billionaires in the world. Now, whether he was motivated by a concern for his own personal investments or by a more generalized class interest or an ideological conservatism, some people would say, no, it wasn't his class interests that were involved. He was ideologically a conservative. Yeah, but his ideology was a class ideology. Or maybe it's a blend of all these three, and there's no reason, by the way, to assume that they're mutually exclusive. Hoover manifested an unswervingly militant opposition to communism and to any revolutionary change that might limit the prerogatives of private enterprise. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1918, he's quoted as saying, "Bolshevism is worse than war." During his tenure as president, Hoover repeatedly made it clear that he opposed public ownership and did not believe in government regulation of the economy. So, what some psychologistic investigators call Herbert Hoover's freeze, his inflexibility, and his compulsion were attitudes that were not personal to him. As President of the United States, he refused to spend the billions of dollars that were needed to ease the plight of the destitute. But Hoover, that wasn't some personal rigidity. Hoover had the support of most of the business community, right up to 1932 and beyond. What the psychological investigator sees as symptomatic of Herbert Hoover's inner character was, in fact, a rather conventionally conservative attitude toward government assistance shared by many others. In fact, it's one you can still hear today. Like so many other conservatives then and now, Herbert Hoover preached the virtues of self-reliance. He opposed taxation on overseas corporations and the like. Hoover repeatedly warned that public assistance programs were the beginning of, quote, state socialism. And I think that's a very revealing comment. His fear was of socialism. But by the way, toward business he was not so rigid. He was actually kind of flexible. He could practice a little bit of socialism toward business. He could dip into the old public treasury. He spent liberally. He supported federal subsidies to shipping interests. He supported federal subsidies to agribusiness, and his Reconstruction Finance Corporation doled out a couple of $1 billion. This is in 1929, 30, 31. A couple of $1 billion to banks and corporations. By the way, all that information is a matter of public record. When the picture it provides us is one of a Hoover that's quite different from this psychologistic Hoover. Rather than moving from flexibility to rigidity because of some inner flaw, Hoover maintained a position that was consistently in line with his class perspective, with his ideology, both in his early days as a relief administrator and later as a president. The man who could assist the murderous White Guard armies, the man who could assist and give aid and take money that was meant to feed children in Eastern Europe and Soviet Russia and give that money to those murderers, to the precursors of Europe's Nazis, would have no trouble ordering General MacArthur to drive out the unarmed Bonus March veterans in an action that left 2 killed and many wounded. The man who, for political class reasons, could withhold funds from starving populations in Eastern Europe and Soviet Russia could, for political reasons, deny relief to American workers. Having fought just 10 years or 15 years before against socialist revolutions in Austria, Hungary, the Baltics, and Russia, President Hoover was not about to introduce what he and many of his supporters considered to be insidious forms of socialism at home, that is, public assistance to those who need it. If you give public assistance to the rich, that's okay. In sum, the mystery about Hoover's character is not to be a mystery at all, unless you mystify it with a lot of psychologisms. The psychological explanations have very little explanatory power and are most useful in distorting and sliding over realities of class power, politics, and wealth. And those are the things we should be looking at, the realities of class power, politics, and wealth. And this is Michael Parenti with some real history. This is Michael Parenti with some real history. This is Michael Parenti with some real history. This is Michael Parenti with some real